This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on is we're now about a quarter century since Congress approved permanent normal trade relations for China, which paved the way for China's entry to the WTO. And it resulted in a dramatic expansion of trade and investment between the U.S. and the PRC. The hope at the time was that trade would over time help us democratize China, create incentives for the Chinese Communist Party to open up society. China would play by the rules-based international order. It would create wealth here and over there, and everything would be great. And instead, the opposite's happened. China's become more repressive, not less. It's used its access to trade and investment to steal our intellectual property and our technology, used its wealth that was produced by all this new expanded bilateral trade and investment to build up its military might. Instead of becoming a force of liberalization, businesses have become de facto foreign agents for China, lobbying Congress against legislation that Beijing didn't like about banning slave labor, for example, small hands of Uyghur children making our sneakers for us. And America's become dependent on China in key strategic sectors, from telecommunications to steel to energetics that we need for our missiles to defend ourselves against China to pharmaceuticals. And then it allowed all these Chinese companies to come into the U.S., which are behaving like Trojan horses. You know, for example, all of our shipping cranes in our ports are built by communist China, and we found out that they have communication systems on them that can be shut off from Beijing. So we've allowed...
Not all, but 70%.
A lot of it. If you remember how COVID crippled our ports, imagine how China shutting down 70% of our shipping cranes would affect. So it seems like this has been one of the great strategic blunders of the late 20th and early 21st century. What do you think, Danny?
Well, first, I don't think that it was a strategic blunder in concept. Okay. And as our guest tells us, you never want to discount the absolutely transformational effect that more open trading has had on hundreds of millions of people. All a good thing. I think the problem, and we really, I think we peel away at this onion in our conversation. The problem is we're such an all or nothing country at this point. And I love that about Americans. When Americans are all in, they're all in. And that's fantastic. And when we're against it, we are all out. But there are ways to manage the world and progress that are, I'm going to use the Barack Obama word that I hate, nuanced, that are strategic. And we seem to be a country that either has a hammer or doesn't. There's nothing in between. There's no needle. There's no scalpel. And that's the issue with China, where, you and I have said this 1,000 times on the podcast. Do I want to get, cheap shoes and Tonka toys from China? For sure. I don't need those made here. I don't care. But I don't want my airliner to come from China. I don't want all of my data to be in China. I don't want the marching automatons of TikTok to be the next generation of Americans who the Chinese can basically tell what to do. And this understanding, right? This, how do you manage, right? The problem with PNTR, right? Remember, everybody, PNTR, permanent normal trading relations. This expression
which replaced most favored nation status,
right, exactly.
Which was annually approved by Congress, and we just made it permanent.
Right. So the problem with that is the word most and the word permanent. If you, in either iteration, we need to have a strategic policy of tariffs and no tariffs on China. And we need to punish the Chinese for the evil things they do, some moral, some economic, some strategic. And we need to decide what we don't care about. And our inability to do this our inability to, again, as our guest says, think longer term about this is a massive handicap for us. And I would add another thing. We've gotten much worse. Where you and I, we'll get together with our respective spouses and bitch about the fact that, our kids have the attention span of gnats, which they do. And I think it's a national phenomenon. It's not just that TV sucks. It's not just that CNN sucks. It's not just that television news and legacy media have bankrupted themselves. It's that we don't want to watch an hour and a half, 2 hours of this stuff when we can get on X and we can get 240-digit bite-sized pieces of news. But we actually are a grown-up country, the most rich, the most powerful country in the world. And we need to have a shrewder approach to our own people and to our enemies.
Well, here's the problem why it's a little bit all or nothing is because one of the problems we have is that because we created this permanent normal trade relation situation and allowed China into the WTO and American business flooded in, moved all of our manufacturing over there and all these critical sectors that we now say, oh, wait, hold on, we shouldn't be exporting all those critical sectors to China and becoming dependent on China. It's almost impossible to turn it around once it's happened because there are built-in interests in keeping it going because they're making lots of money. I mean, just look at how hard it is. We now know that TikTok is a Chinese Trojan horse. They're collecting all this data on Americans. Oh, but there's 180 million people who are on TikTok and people have built entire businesses on TikTok and you're going to destroy them. And so everybody's lobbying against something that should be a 2-minute decision in the first minutes for coffee about whether we should ban TikTok or not. And, and let somebody else build a replacement that's not with servers that aren't in China and they don't have to get that. There's a built-in incentive, and it's almost impossible to reverse once you do this. And what's happening now is China, having sucked up all of our manufacturing in key sectors that we should have never given them, is now building itself up and insulating itself against the U.S. with industrial policy. There was a front page story in the Wall Street Journal. It says, headline, "She pursues economic fortress as shield against U.S. pressure." Let me just read you this quote. China is racing to make itself less reliant on the outside world's product and technology, part of a years-long effort by leader Xi Jinping to make China more self-sufficient and impervious to Western pressure as tensions with the U.S. rise. They're investing billions of dollars, especially in high-end manufacturing, while exhorting business leaders to fall in line with the government's priorities. Instead of relying on foreign companies for robots and medical devices, China is making more of its own. We got rid of industrial policy. We had free trade. They sucked up the manufacturing, and now they're having industrial policy to shield themselves from us in case there's a trade war or a real war where they are not dependent on us. So, maybe we ought to be doing the same thing over here a little bit.
You know what? But that's the kind of laziness, I'm sorry, that's the kind of laziness that I can't stand. We don't need to do the same thing. In fact,
yes,
we are the world's, wait a minute, we are the world's largest economy, okay? We have the world's most powerful military. What we need to do is have a strategy to protect us and our allies and exclude the Chinese. We do not need to become China. And this is the problem.
I'm not saying we need to become China.
You just said those words.
No, I didn't. I said we need to.
I don't want Xi Jinping running my industrial policy.
Well, I don't want Xi Jinping running my industrial policy either, but I want Donald Trump running my industrial policy.
I don't.
We had Mike Gallagher on this podcast, and he, for many, many times, and on one of his many appearances, he pointed out that we're dependent on China for energetics. Energetics are what we put into our missiles to make them fly and explode. Like, how could we possibly have allowed ourselves to not produce energetics here in the United States? How can we be dependent on China for steel? How can we be dependent on China for the key components of our pharmaceuticals, which we discovered during the pandemic? We have discovered so many areas where we have become dependent on our adversary that maybe we ought to have I don't believe in industrial policy as a matter of economics. I do believe in it as a matter of foreign policy. Just like it was a mistake to put Anthony Fauci in charge of the U.S. economy because Immunologists should not be running an economy, even though they're really good immunologists. We don't necessarily have to put economists in charge of our foreign policy. We have to balance these things, and we have done a terrible job over the last quarter century of balancing our national security interests with our economic interests. Am I wrong?
That is a fair statement. Your remedy
Thank
is
you.
not exactly what I'm looking for. I want to mention one last thing to people because I want to direct people who are interested in this to the work of Derek Scissors. Derek, our colleague at AEI, really an outstanding China economist, can't stand the Trump administration for whatever it is, and that infuses a lot of what he does. But he gives the president outstanding advice, right? And that is, do not lie to yourself that these tariffs are a way of isolating China and reconstituting American leadership. The right thing for us to do is to get China out of our supply chains. And that, I think you would agree with, I agree with, and that is really where I have not seen Donald Trump do what is necessary, in large part because it requires the scalpel that he does not like to wield.
In the first 3 weeks of the administration, you're right.
Dude,
And also, maybe
we don't all need to line up behind him and note how handsome he is.
That's not what I'm doing, Danny. And by the way, the other thing we need to do, we need to get them out of our friggin' universities. Our universities have become entwined with the CCP. I remember I was doing a story for the Post digging into Vivek Ramaswamy's ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And
that was great.
I found out through research that he was in business with the same princelings of the CCP that had funded Hunter Biden. How did I find that out? Because after the Panama Papers leaked, they wiped all of their information off the maps. That you couldn't search anything about them. I couldn't confirm that they were associated with this company. You know where I found it? On the Yale Business School website, because they were both part of their China initiative. So these princelings who are in business with Hunter Biden and in business with Vivek Ramaswamy, the only place I could confirm who they were was Yale University School of Business. If that doesn't tell you something about how Yale has been corrupted by Chinese money, how Harvard has been corrupted by Chinese money, how MIT and all these universities have been corrupted by Chinese money, they actually do a thing where they're not allowed to get access to the lab, so they pay these people to come to China and recreate their research in China and provide them, and they're stealing our intellectual property left, right, and center. So they're infiltrating us, they're sucking up our manufacturing, and they're infiltrating ours. And we are doing nothing to stop it.
Well, we're certainly not doing enough. But that's not really what we talk about. We're really talking about manufacturing in China. And Mark and I have just, as usual, digressed enormously. But everybody's going to love our next guest. It's his first time on with us. But as I say to him when we thank him, he's a great explainer, which is an undervalued quality with economists. So David Autor is the Daniel and Gail Rubenfeld Professor in the MIT Department of Economics. He's the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Labor Studies Program and the MIT Shaping the Future of Work Initiative. He's an elected fellow of the Econometric Society and therefore will be horrified when he listens that Mark doesn't know how to do math. He's part of the Society of Labor Economists, and he has 98 other titles. You guys are going to love him. Here's our interview.
David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So glad to have you. So there was a great Wall Street Journal story the other day on your news study about how the China shock rippled through the U.S. It hit manufacturing communities in the Southeast and parts of the Midwest particularly hard. And many of the places that were hit came back, but the people who got hit did not. Can you tell us a little bit about what your findings were?
Sure, absolutely. So my co-authors and I, David Dorn and Gordon Hansen, and we're joined by Bradley Setzler of Penn State University and Maggie Jones of the U.S. Census Bureau. Sets of us have been working on this question of the China trade shock since about 2013, or actually a couple of years earlier. Our first publication was 2013. What we documented at that time was how impactful this was, not just for U.S. manufacturing, but the communities where manufacturing was housed. And when I say the China trade shock, what do I mean? I mean China joining the WTO in 2001 and just the torrent of imports and the rising trade deficit in U.S. manufacturing goods. And that's not intrinsically a bad thing. You get lower price goods, but it does require a lot of reallocation of people. If you're going to be importing a lot of manufacturing goods and not exporting them, to maintain full employment, you're going to need a lot of people to switch to outside of manufacturing, to non-manufacturing. And that didn't happen very much. So we've been working on this topic for quite a while, but what we really hadn't had a chance to look at is kind of long run impacts. And so we used data from 2000 and 2019 to understand how this has played out. It was important to understand there was a huge surge in Chinese exports in 2000, 2007. Then we had the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, a big further decline in manufacturing. And then things really plateaued. And they didn't change much. During the Obama years, they didn't change much. During the Trump years, they didn't change much. During the Biden years, there was some growth, but very modest. And so you could think of a lot of this, at least China Shock 1.0, as most of it having played out a decade ago, and we're been in the adjustment process. And so what we wanted to see is have places bounce back, have people bounce back, and we got very different answers to those two different questions. So if you look at the places that were most impacted, meaning they were making the things that China started selling to us, and so they stopped making them, they have in some ways regenerated themselves. They've kind of reconstituted. They actually have more people have moved in. They don't have higher employment to population rates, but they have more people. But the people who moved in tend to be US-born Hispanics, more women working, relatively fewer men working, more college graduates working, more foreign-born residents working there. And the incumbents, especially the incumbents in manufacturing, who tended to be non-college educated white men, have kind of not rebounded in the way you might have expected. You might have thought they would move to other places and find new jobs. You might have thought they would have moved out of manufacturing to non-manufacturing. But in fact, we see very little of that. In fact, my mobility rates out to other local labor markets actually declines when the shock occurs. We have very modest reallocation. Instead, we see people in manufacturing kind of hanging on. Their wages are not growing as fast as we would have expected them to. And so the world has changed a lot around them, but they have not changed that much themselves in terms of what they are doing. And so the adjustment, you could say, is kind of generational. There's a whole new generation of workers who have entered. There's a lot of young workers, but for the folks who are at the point of impact, they haven't seen the benefit from the dynamism. They've mostly hung on.
It sounds like there's been a wealth transfer, a work transfer from the working class to sort of the middle class educated elites as a result of the China shock. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, no, I mean, in these communities where this occurred, a lot of these are US-born Hispanics, and they're not educated elites. They have low rates of college attainment. And these are lower wage jobs, and many of them are in low paid services. So they are, warehousing, big box stores, some non-traded medical services, some primary and secondary education. So the whole wage structure has actually shifted towards, kind of lower paid work. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't call them elites who are in these areas. These areas have reconstituted as kind of, you might call them sort of brownfields labor markets, where, there's kind of new activity going on where, but a very different activity. And in general, the people there, some are more educated, but a lot of the foreign-born workers are, they're first generation college educated, but they're running stores, they're working in education, healthcare services. These are not high-tech organizations they're running. And then a lot of the other workers are non-college workers working in relatively low-paid activities.
So, first of all, this is absolutely fascinating. I'm going to be a terrible market capitalist because my grip on economics is tenuous at best, as AEI's economists constantly tell me. But this is interesting information. It's important information. Why overall do we care? Yes, of course. Mark will say Trump voters, right? People in Lordstown, Ohio, Mark's favorite place that I've never been and don't actually know where it is. But it sounds to me like what you have identified is that adaptation has happened, sectoral adaptation has happened among certain population cohorts. In other words, that people have flowed in to these jobs where they exist. The problem is stagnation among the guys who used to make the buggy whips and who simply don't want to do, it's not that they don't want to learn to code, it's that they don't want to learn how to make anything that isn't a buggy whip.
It's not buggy whips, Danny. It's steel, it's cars, it's stuff that we
Mark, you
use
can
all
write
the
Trump's
time.
speech later. Let David answer.
So actually, this is primarily not high-tech manufacturing. It much more would have been, textiles, shoes, clothing, assembly, dolls and toys. But a lot of Southern manufacturing was relatively low-wage manufacturing, but these were good jobs for non-college men. Let's be clear. They paid more than the outside alternative. So why should we care? I mean, so I'm not making a case for, how you feel about it. If you thought that everyone benefited from, lots of cheap imports coming in all at once and, just we have a reemployment program, it's called Get a New Job, that didn't work. You could see why a lot of people would feel unhappy about that. And especially because they were told it would be fine. Just to understand the context, right? The Clinton administration negotiated China's accession to the WTO. They actually, Gene Sperling went to China and negotiated these basically safety valves on China's WTO joining so that if things happen too fast, the U.S. could put on the brakes, could, in case of emergency, break glass. Then the Bush administration came in and had no interest in putting on the brakes. It was of the view that, everybody wins. That's what the theory says. It's not actually what the theory says, but that's what they believe the theory says. And so nothing to worry about. And we even, I believe one of their famous, cabinet members said, we're just a nation of whiners. Everyone's complaining. Stop complaining. It turned out it didn't work out very well for a lot of people. And we didn't have programs and policies in place to help them adjust. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, in net, a lot of people benefit from cheaper imports, right? If you shop at Walmart or you buy a big TV or many, many things, you have lower prices, no question. However, if there's those very substantial gains and then very concentrated costs on a small set of people, and it is relatively small, it's, a few million people. That's small relative to the labor market, 150 million people. Obviously, to those few million people, that matters a lot. You could say, look, we ought to at least, have some programs in place to ease the adjustment. And we do know that there are programs that we have had that have worked. So trade adjustment assistance is very hard to get access to, but in general, when it gets people into educational programs, they tend to do better. Even the Obama administration ran an experiment where they just gave people what's called wage insurance, where they said, look, if you were making $25 an hour and you moved to a $15 an hour job because you lost your job due to trade, we'll make up half the difference for a year. And that helped people move back into the labor market more quickly. It didn't help them earn a lot more, but it got them working sooner. So it's still, non-employment is actually very scarring to people itself. So it helped people make the adjustment. Even that is much, much, much better than nothing. So I don't think it's either or. It's not, we must have trade and just, some people will suffer, or we can't have trade because some people will be harmed. We could be a little more thoughtful than that.
Right. And I think that I think that's exactly right. I think the problem is that we either want to believe a rising tide lifts all boats, which it clearly doesn't, or we want to believe that the rising tide drowned out vast numbers of people with the injustice of evil Chinese imports and exports and blah, 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 blah. Now, Mark and I have talked a ton with basically everybody in this field about why the theory behind bringing China into the WTO, basically tying them in the fetters of the global rules of the road, which, they didn't abide by, which really had the exact opposite impact that we believed it was going to have on China. Amazing for us. I really like being able to buy stuff from Amazon and Walmart, but yes, in terms of China, it did not, in fact, tie them up in these silken fetters in any way. It had the opposite impact. But let's talk more about these people for a second, because the right conclusion to draw here is not we shouldn't be importing cheap Chinese stuff. The right conclusion to draw is it's a lie to say rising tide lifts all boats, and more needs to be done to help people adapt. Am I grasping the right?
I would say that I think it's certainly right that not everyone benefits. And this has been long understood about trade, right? Anyone who says that trade is supposed to make everyone better off doesn't understand the theory. The theory says that, free trade among consenting nations makes those nations richer. It doesn't say everybody in the nation gets richer. And in fact, it says some people will get poorer. The people who are specifically have skills and, capital that specifically competes with things that are getting cheaper. So what do we take from that? I mean, a couple things. One is, certainly we should have programs in place to assist people. But I think a deeper lesson is it matters how fast you make these transitions. And part of what made the China talk so shocking is that it occurred so quickly. If we say, autonomous vehicles are coming 20 years from now, we will not have long haul truckers. Well, that's something we can adjust to. We have 20 years. People retire out of that occupation. They don't enter it if they know it's not going to be there and so on. So that's a manageable. It's over the course of a career, we can do things like that. If we said, come President's Day, no more long haul truckers, 4 million people will be out of work. that would be disaster, right? It's the same thing, but it matters on what time span it occurs. So I do think we actually mishandled this. I would say that the Clinton administration tried to set up the possibility of a slow transition. The Bush administration was ideologically not aligned with that. That didn't happen. And also, I think economists really did not give accurate predictions about how consequential this would be. I mean, my profession was very gung-ho about free trade and sort of said, yeah, the theory says it could have some costs and benefits and some people could be worse off, but the evidence doesn't really support that much happens. But in fact, the evidence wasn't very good. And so sort of the absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence. And now we know otherwise. And so I think the point of this paper is to say, well, how has this played out? And I think you could say, look, there's a generational adjustment. There's certainly a set of people who are better off in those places. And it's created all kinds of new opportunities. And those places are, they're not dust bowls, right? They're coming back. But it's very different. And the people who are on the upside of that are not the people who are on the downside of that. And what's remarkable is the degree of stasis among the people who were on the downside. You might have thought, oh, they've kind of moved to somewhere else. But I think, well, why didn't they move to somewhere else? I think that's a legitimate question. We don't know. I mean, my leading theory is, look, there was not a better place to go, right? It's not like the world was said, oh, give us your laid off textile workers, we'll make them into kings, right? That wasn't happening. And so it wasn't, they sort of like, well, our incomes are down. This is where our family is. We don't know of a better opportunity. So why would we, what should we pull up stakes for and go head for?
So, I remember listening to a colleague who I respected, AEI, during the debate over TPP, saying, well, the studies show there's no net job loss from TPP. And I kept thinking, well, there's a net job loss for the auto worker in Lordstown, Ohio. There is. And, why is it that the auto worker in Lordstown, Ohio doesn't move to, they got states like North Dakota, which are like begging for workers. And, there's places where there's tons of jobs. In the last few years, we've had a massive labor shortage in the United States. We've had record numbers of unfilled jobs. Half of small businesses reported they couldn't find workers.
Manufacturing can't find workers either, actually.
Well, so that's fascinating. Why is that? Because it's one thing if China makes our sneakers and our T-shirts. It's another thing if we're dependent on them for shipping cranes, and we're dependent on them for steel, and we're dependent on them for pharmaceuticals, and we're dependent on them for the explosives for our missiles. There's all sorts of things that maybe economically would be smarter and cheaper to have them make, but probably doesn't make national security sense. How do we fix that? How do we find workers for those jobs?
I think it's a very hard problem. And it is the case that it's very difficult to get those things back once you lose them, because manufacturing has kind of what economists call increasing returns, right? You need a whole ecosystem, right? You can't just be going it alone as an auto factory. You need a whole supporting supply chain of manufacturers and workers. That's one reason China can scale up so quickly. They have these massive industrial cities where there are 10,000 production engineers just available to set up a new assembly line. So once you lose that scale, it's very hard to get it back. So I do think that the thing to think about is not how do we get back our textile jobs, but how do we protect and revitalize the sectors that we have. And that's got to be a combination of, I'm not totally unsympathetic to some tariffs and certain types of certainly fair trade protections, right? Where I think bilaterally where, China is saying, well, give us your IP and we're going to tariff your products, but, don't put any restrictions on us. We don't allow Google. We don't allow Facebook. But what are you doing to TikTok? How is that allowed? If you say it's crazy, so asymmetric. But simultaneously, you have to invest. And this is what I think the Biden administration actually got right about this. They said, look, we're going to make investment feasible we're going to make massive investments in EVs, in transforming the power grid, in new forms of energy generation. You may or may not like all those things, but and even the Chips and Sciences Act, which just said we're going to try to set up industrial parks in different places. If you say we're running a race against China, we are in many ways, we have two tools at our disposal. One is we can try to trip them up and hobble them. The other is we could bulk up and run faster. And we're going to have to do both. You cannot, over the long run, just keep throwing sand at your competitor and hope they're just going to keep slipping. That's not going to happen. And so we have to be willing to do the expensive stuff as well as the cheap stuff. The cheap stuff is like, let's put tariffs on. The expensive stuff is let's invest in ourselves. And we need to, those are complementary activities.
So it's fascinating what you were saying about how hard it is to rescale up manufacturing once you've lost it, right?
Yeah.
So in defense manufacturing, one of the things that we discovered was that because of the war on terror, we had stopped making Stinger missiles because our enemies were terrorists. They weren't countries with fighter jets. And so we didn't have to take down fighter jets. And so then the Ukraine war started. and the Ukraine needed Stinger missiles because we gave them our stockpiles. And Raytheon found they didn't have the knowledge of how to make a Stinger missile anymore. They had to bring people out of retirement to teach a new generation of Raytheon employees how to set up a plant and build a Stinger missile. It seems like that's a problem across. If we're trying to reindustrialize in key strategic sectors to insulate ourselves from China for national security reasons, that seems like a major issue that we're going to have in steel manufacturing, in pharmaceuticals, in like all sorts of key strategic areas. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, you have to choose your targets. Not to take the Stinger missile analogy too far, but we're not big enough and rich enough to like decide we're going to win in every battle, every game, right? We can't say, oh, we're going to win in solar and in EV and also, in steel and also in semiconductors. You got to choose the sectors that are very important and invest in them. And part of that is not allowing them to atrophy further. And part of them is rejuvenating. Like our defense contracting sectors are ossified. And another thing the Ukraine war has taught us is we're buying the wrong weapons, right? We need to, the US doesn't really make drones, but drones are the future of warfare. That's very clear. So if you had to choose a sector there, that's what you would, you certainly would prioritize that one. And there is actually a lot of there's more Silicon Valley interest in military technology than there used to be. And I think that's reasonable. I don't love war any more than the next guy, but I do think we need a defense sector to protect ourselves. And yeah, I think you have to choose carefully. But it really, and this is what I find frustrating in some policies, is the notion is we can do things that are cheap, that appear cheap. We can cut taxes. We can apply tariffs, which appear cheap because we're bringing in money. It's actually not cheap. It costs consumers a great deal of money. But there's also the hard stuff of we have to rebuild our infrastructure. We have to actually rebuild our power grid. We actually have to say tariffs may help in the short run, but then you have to get these sectors growing, right? So you say, what are we prioritizing? What matters? I certainly semiconductors, telecommunications, avionics, right? Aircraft transportation. It's just a matter of years before China has a quite robust Boeing competitor that is making much cheaper planes. So, we will be very unhappy if we lose Boeing and Airbus and General Motors and Intel. And, that requires playing the long game. And that's what the US is not good at, is playing the long game. There's much to admire about the way China goes about conducting itself in world affairs. And they're laughing that the US is cutting off the US Agency for International Development. They make enormous investments in soft power. They are the biggest investor in most of the poor world right now. And people notice that. And if the US says, well, we're not helping you fight AIDS and we're not going to feed you and we're not going to support education, well, those things paid off and people thinking the US really was exceptional in having a set of values that the rest of the world wanted to embrace. So we need to be able to play the long game. And the long game means making thoughtful, selective decisions and making some long-term investments like we made with the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. You could never pass a Marshall Plan today. Be like, what? Foreign aid? But that was an incredibly valuable investment the United States made at that time.
So without diving into the aid issue, where I think Mark and I both see the point of some of what you're saying, I think, look, the problem with the United States is we're lazy. And so when we do things in a lazy way, we like to continue doing it in a lazy way rather than fixing it. That's not how tech bros see the world and how they see innovation. And so we're sort of caught in that tension right now. But I wanted to ask you about tariffs, because you raised this question of tariffs. And obviously, Donald Trump thinks that's the most beautiful word in the English language. He gets to be president and I don't. But one of the things that reading through your work suggests to me is tariffs may be great leverage, but in terms of delivering, restituting jobs to people who lost them in the manufacturing sector, that ain't happening.
No, that's not going to
happen.
happen.
To us?
No. I mean, if you want to make a principled case for tariffs, it would have to be that it's going to give you time to fortify a sector and prevent you from losing it. It's not going to bring anything back. And if it does, it's going to do it at extraordinary cost. And we saw this in the case of washing machines, right? The cost per job, kind of recovered or retained for washing machines was about $890,000 in consumer prices per job. And when we tariffed Korean washing machines, the price of US washing machines went up by 12%. And the price of dryers went up by 12%. They weren't even tariff. The dryer companies are like, well, if you're going to buy a washing machine, you might as well buy a dryer, and guess we should synchronize those prices. So it's not a good, you have to be, again, you could say, look, we're willing to pay those crazy prices for a while because we want to build, right? I don't think washing machines is a strategic sector myself, right? I think EVs are. I think, not solar collectors, which I think are a commodity, but, wind turbines, a big deal. And I think, again, telecoms, semiconductors, transportation, these really, really matter. And steel, that was the other point I forgot to make, is we don't have to make everything ourselves. We have allies that we can rely on. We just have to know who they are. Japan is an ally, an incredible ally, right? So is Korea. So is most of Western Europe. We need to distinguish between who are our competitors and who's on our team. And we're not large enough. China has 3 times the population that we do. It's a juggernaut. And we cannot expect that what we can do is first cast all our allies off the bus, then go it alone. And so I don't understand the failure to make that distinction.
Well, so Taiwan is an ally, and it makes 90% of the high level semiconductors in the world. Japan is an ally, but if there's a war in the Pacific and Taiwan is surrounded by Chinese ships and Japan is engaged in combat, that undermines our ability to depend on either China or Taiwan for critical things.
I think Taiwan, obviously, that's why we're building these semiconductor plants in the United States, because Taiwan is very much under threat, and I will not be surprised if China invades Taiwan in the next few years. However, I don't think that's likely for Japan. And I think the U.S. would, if that were the case, the U.S. would be in that war.
Okay, but it's thousands and thousands of miles away. It's in the war zone. It could be very hard to move things from Japan to the United States when there's a war over Taiwan, and Japan might be engaged in that struggle beside us.
Sure. Right, but Japan just want to make an enormous investment in U.S. steel to make it here.
Yeah,
and both the Biden and Trump teams thought that was a bad idea, and that was damaging to America. And the U.S. Steel has been a moribund corporation for decades and technologically atavistic. And
they just announced that they're making a big investment.
So Trump, and I'm glad Trump changed his mind on that. And I was extremely disappointed that Biden was so cowardly on that, because that was the right decision to make all along. Because Japan is an ally, and you might say, well, they're vulnerable. Well, they're investing in us.
Well, if we're going to be strategic about it, why is it so hard for us to build chip manufacturing, high-tech chip manufacturing in the U.S.? Why is it so hard for us to revive our steel industry? Whatever we pick as the ones that we want to make here at home, why are we having such a hard time doing it?
Well, so TSMC chips are now being made in Arizona. We're a more expensive place to do business. We actually have more regulation, and we don't have the cadres of PhD engineers, right? We actually should be and I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for one side or the other, but we should be allowing more people in on H-1B visas to do that work, right? There's a lot of talented people.
The president agrees with that.
Oh, well, I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad. And so, it is hard, and you have to get scale. And, the reason we lost the leadership in chips was it was really just a strategic failure on Intel's part. That was not inevitable. That was not like the U.S. can't make chips anymore. It just got generations behind. But that didn't have to happen. So yeah, but I agree. You have to choose. Well, we're really good at chip design. When chips are manufactured in Taiwan, but they're made with U.S. software and U.S. designs and made with Dutch machines, right? Those things are dependent on German parts. So it is actually the most complex supply chain in the history of the world that leads to those machines that make those chips. So it's actually a pretty distributed process. I think if China were to invade Taiwan, I don't think they would get those TSMC plants working very effectively. But they would harm us plenty. If they're not working, we suffer a lot. So, that's something to worry about. Part of it also is rebuilding infrastructure, right? We need to have a modern power transmission facility. We need to actually have roads and even rail in some cases. We got to invest in ourselves.
Nuclear power?
Sure, nuclear power is great. And I think there's modern, old plants are now being brought back online, like 3 Mile Island, and there are more modern designs but again, we have to be able to make those risky investments, right? China is actually standing up new nuclear power plants of modern designs. The U.S. is having so much trouble doing it. We have regulated ourselves to death in many ways, and we trip over our own feet in trying to get stuff done. And we got to, it is a very sad, I'm very unhappy that the Trump administration has pulled all this funding for building EV charging stations. I'm also very unhappy that the Biden administration got 59 of them built over the course of 3 years with billions of dollars in investment, right? Now, that is also a failure. It's not enough to appropriate money. You actually have to make stuff happen. And the U.S. has gotten much, much worse at that. On the other hand, we have some great entrepreneurs. So it's not like nothing good happens. First of all, we're still the most innovative country in the world. We're just not that very good at making stuff. And, I mean, I'm not a big fan personally of Elon Musk, but I have a huge admiration for Tesla and SpaceX, right? And, so those are incredible achievements, and those were done in America. So we shouldn't think it's not feasible.
Right. It's definitely feasible. But luckily, if we impose tariffs on TSMC, that will fix the entire problem of all of that, which Donald Trump has fully articulated that he intends to do. I want to ask you about one last aspect, because like everything in Washington, we become fixated on a topic and then we have to ask everybody about that topic. But it does have a nexus with what you're talking about in terms of manufacturing jobs and losses and adaptation, and that is AI. You've done some writing about this as
Yeah.
well, and it was very interesting to me, the kind of, I think you came to some pretty interesting counterintuitive conclusions about AI's impact, what AI will replace, and if we understand those better, I think we also could sort of hopefully adapt better. Tell us a little bit about that, and that's my exit question.
Sure. So that's a big, big topic. And, artificial intelligence is, first of all, you need to understand what makes AI different from prior waves of computing. Prior waves of computing just followed rules, right? You write a script, it would play the notes. Whatever. You write the sheet music, it would play the notes. AI can learn the way we do from immersion without structure, and it can predict. And so can be used to support decision making and judgment. And that makes it potentially possible for a lot more people to engage in important expert judgmental work, like in healthcare, in law, in software development, in design, in skilled construction repair, with better tools. And so my hope, and this is not by no means guarantee, is we can use it to enable, as manufacturing has declined, as office work has declined, a lot of people who don't have college degrees find themselves doing low-paid personal services, food service, cleaning, security, entertainment, recreation. That's socially valuable work. That's all good work. But it pays poorly because it doesn't use expert skill sets. And so many, many people can do it. And so that, tends to depress pay because there's a lot of people who are competing for that work. If we could enable more people to do valuable healthcare services, they don't all have to be doctors, to do coding without having to have a bachelor's degree in computer science, to allow paralegals to write more contracts, to allow people who are doing skilled repair to solve harder problems, or contractors to design kitchens, that could extend the range of human expertise, not simply replace it. And I think, I don't want to be utopian, there's going to be job loss, there's going to be skills that are devalued. It's not all, by no means all good, but I think there's positive potential. People are focused so much on the catastrophic potential consequences that they're neglecting that also, provides potentially amazing tools, and tools are essential to making our skills more valuable, right? Most of us, I couldn't do my work without my tool. If I didn't have my computer, I couldn't be an empirical economist. It would take me a lifetime to do what I do in 15 minutes on my computer. If I were an air traffic controller and I didn't have a two-way radio and radar and GPS, I would just be a guy standing in a field staring at the sky, right? We need tools. And so AI has a potential to make our skills more valuable by shortening the distance between intention and result.
It's interesting because if you look through the history of technological advancement, most technological advancements have created more wealth and improved society over time, but they tended to threaten the jobs of people on the lower end of the economic spectrum and benefit people on the higher end of the economic spectrum, at least initially, right? AI seems to be, the conventional wisdom seems to be, the manufacturing versus, when you start having machines make things in the manufacturing process that hurt people on the lower end, but the people who own the factories did great. AI seems to be the first technology that seems to threaten people on the higher end of the economic spectrum. And you're saying it actually could bring people from the lower end of the spectrum up a little bit because they can harness AI to do things that make them more expert. Is that the point you're?
That's the good scenario, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Now, I could be wrong, but I think it's in the good scenario. It creates more competition at the top by allowing more people to compete with elites. Now, let me say that technologies, the Industrial Revolution really created the world's middle class, so it wasn't all bad. It first displaced artisans, which was terrible for those artisans, right? The Luddites who rose up against the power looms in the Victorian era, they were right. Their skills were devalued, their careers were destroyed. But eventually, the Industrial Revolution actually created a lot of mass prosperity.
So the Luddites had a point?
Oh, they absolutely absolutely had a point. Yeah. History has treated them very unfairly. They weren't opposed to technology per se. They were opposed to losing their jobs, right? Technology is a lot like trade, in fact. It creates disruption. It creates net benefits, but the people who are on the beneficiary side are usually not the same people who are on the losing side. And that transition is very painful. Like Pittsburgh rebuilt itself, right, after the great inflation recession of the early 1980s, the Reagan recession, where all the coal and steel they shut down, and Pittsburgh was decimated. It is now a vibrant city, but it's education, healthcare. Those people at those hospitals are not displaced steelworkers, right? It's a different generation. And so we should be sensitive to the notion, I just think there's this bipolar, either, take your medicine, that's the way the world is, or, oh, we can't change anything because someone could get hurt. The world is dynamic, and we see that, but we should recognize that if we're going to take these decisions that create a lot of benefits, we should think about how to make these transitions more feasible for people, less costly, less painful, and more successful. And if they're more successful, we all benefit, not just those individuals.
Right. This is more underscoring the importance of adaptation. And I couldn't agree more. I want to ask you a question, and I lied. I said that was my exit question. But you raised a question in my mind. So we should have no doubt that 50 years ago, people who were too stupid to figure out how to give you change in a store now can work in a store because they don't need to figure out how to give you change. The computer figures out how to give you change and tells you what to give. And if you're really dumb, it will actually count it out and give it to you. The only question, I guess, is in my mind is if we talk about this idea that you articulate about AI really providing a booster service, if you want, right? Enabling certain people who don't have the capacity to do things that heretofore they were not allowed to do. Don't we create a permanent class of idiots?
Okay, so many reactions to that.
What do we do when they hit our power grid and we lose all the AI and we lose all the computers?
Figure out how to give anybody change.
And we won't be able to get to the store, much less without our Google Maps, much less count change.
So first of all, let me say, I don't think there was ever a time when people were too stupid to count change, but they were not necessarily literate or numerate. But, when the U.S. started sending its entire population to high school in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a big concern that, high school diploma, that's an elite degree. Are these cretins really even capable of completing high school? It turns out everyone's capable of completing high school. And so there was a view that there just wasn't enough natural talent. And that I don't think that there's any evidence to support that. It is the case, however, that if everyone can do something, it's no longer expert. So if the cashiers are much more productive than they were 50 years ago, their throughput is much higher because they just scan stuff. They don't get paid more. They still get paid minimum wage. And the reason is because their skills are not scarce, right? If everyone's expert, no one's expert. And so it matters that there's skill differentiation. I'm not saying that if AI enables everyone to do everything, then that's a world without scarcity of human expertise. And that's not a good world, actually. We need a world where expertise is rewarded. So we still specialize, but we have better tools so we can do those things better. And potentially more people can compete in those arenas.
So exit question for me, bringing us back to where we started, which is the China shock. So permanent normal trade relations in roughly in 2000, joined the WTO. Everybody said this is going to be great for everybody, right? China is going to become more democratic, and we're here in the United States. It's going to increase our wealth and all the rest of it. It seems like everything that was promised by China's accession to the WTO has the opposite has happened.
It did lower goods prices. We predicted that, and that wasn't wrong. But the China's trajectory was definitely
and they've made a lot of their wealth by stealing our technology. They can steal our designs and then have industrial policy to make it cheaper. It's made them wealthier. It's made them more repressive. We've exported away our capability of building things that we now depend on them for. We've got corporations in this country who have become essentially foreign agents for the Chinese Communist Party, advocating against laws to ban slave labor and things like that. Was WTO a mistake?
So it's a slightly complicated answer to that question. First of all,
it's a very freighted question, but it's almost unfair to ask.
But let me start with the first point, which is, China's rise has been incredibly good for humanity, right? It has catapulted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. We've never had as many people in the world's middle class, and not just in China, but in Central and South America, in Sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the reason,
India.
China is ubiquitous in Sub-Saharan Africa. They're building all the roads, they're building the hotels, they're building the power. You might say it's a nefarious plant to, get governments in debt and so on, but really those people are very glad of it. And we used to do more of that. And so I think we should recognize that it's been tough on the US, but it has been, from a human welfare perspective, this is the best thing that's happened to humanity in millennia, perhaps forever, in terms of bringing so much of the world out of starvation and abject poverty. In terms of how this went, I think there are two things. One was foreseeable and one was not foreseeable. I think it went way too fast and it should have been a much more gradual process. I don't think if we had not let China into WTO and then China had gone south or anti-democratic as well, we would have blamed ourselves and said, well, if we'd only let them into WTO, it would have worked out well.
Yeah.
Turned out that was wrong, but we wouldn't have known that. We should have known to go slower. I think what has happened since, it's not because China had access to markets that it took this authoritarian turn. I think that was very idiosyncratic. I don't think that was inevitable. I don't think that was foreseeable. It really, under Deng Xiaoping, that was not the direction it was going. It was Hu Jintao and then Xi Jinping who really changed the direction of the country. I think these figures historically are really important, and it is amazing how much history does sometimes turn on a few people. So I don't think that was fully foreseeable. But we were very, very slow in catching on to how wrong this had gone and responding appropriately. And so, you probably got this already. I'm not the biggest Trump supporter, but I did think that Trump was absolutely correct to call attention to the U.S.'s problematic relationship with China and try to shift that balance. And that did change the debate utterly. I mean, the Biden administration did not change those tariffs, and it started erecting more walls. So I think there's now consensus on that, and it was too late in coming. And I do think we're in the midst of a second China shock. And it's a much more significant one because this one is going for the jugular. Maybe that's the wrong analogy. This one is about the sectors that we care about. We might say, it's painful, it's horrible, but losing textiles does not threaten our military security or innovation capacity or our global leadership. But that's not true for making vehicles. That's not true for making airplanes. That's not making true for semiconductors or telecommunications or avionics.
Or AI.
Or AI, absolutely. Or actually shipping and cranes, although the U.S. has never been good at shipping, ironically, but we make it too expensive for ourselves with the Jones Act. So I think this is very, very serious. And I think other countries are also waking up to this. Germany is now feeling this very directly. Germany was a huge beneficiary for a while because China bought, if you spent much time in Beijing 10 years ago, everyone was driving a black Audi. But that's not the case anymore. And I think, this is something that is an urgent priority. And it's not just about jobs. It was easy when it was just about jobs. Now this is much, much deeper.
Yeah.
Amen
You
to
said
that.
there's a second China shock happening now. What is the lesson from the first China shock and how we responded to it to managing the second China shock?
Well, the first lesson is don't just assume it'll all be fine. That, all trade is good trade. If they want to sell you something and you want to buy it, go for it. I think we have, the world is just a little more complicated than that. And so I think the other lesson that we've been discussing is we need to choose the sectors where we need to remain strong and we need to invest in them. And that's, many of the examples we just mentioned, and that's going to be incredibly critical. Another lesson, and I think this lesson really needs to be heard in Washington present, is we need our allies to work with us on this. We do not want to work against them. And if we do, they will cut side deals that we won't like. And that was the virtue of TPP, by the way. There are many things you could criticize about it, but it was meant to set up a bulwark in Asia against China's dominance. It was meant to be a regulatory apparatus for setting rules on intellectual property and rules of the road. It had its cost for sure, but it was actually forward-looking in terms of the geopolitical and economic strategic challenges we would be facing.
Yeah, amen to that. We need more friendshoring, but we haven't found the middle ground between the conventional wisdom and Donald Trump's system. So thank you. You're amazing and very clear. And one of the worst things about economists is that they start to sound like nuclear scientists where we have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And Mark and I walk away and we're like, well, that was good. What was he saying? I have no idea. So thank you for being lucid and clear and not hard to understand. Really important lessons.
No. Thanks for this fair-minded conversation.
Thank you.
Awesome. Take care.
Okay, Danny, so you talked about the people who are too stupid to make change. That's me. So when I was in college, I went and moved to Paris for a summer, and I got a job at American Express making change for like changing banknotes, and not a single day did I come out with a balance sheet that was accurate. And because of French labor laws, they couldn't fire me, but I was losing the money every single day because I couldn't make the change. So in that, I'm the person who gets enabled by the advance of AI and the automation of all that.
Listeners, draw your own conclusions.
I'm much better at national security than I am at math.
Okay. Alrighty then. So I will say this. You may be bad at change, and as I said, draw your own inferences on that, listeners. But I do think the dumbing down of our society is actually more important than David suggested. And I say that because we are very much the fancy elites. We see the kids who our kids go to school with in some of the best school districts, whether private, parochial, public. Our kids go to great universities. We see the kids who go to great universities with them. I see the kids at Georgetown who are, absolutely in the upper echelon of educational attainment. But I've got to say, having been able to look at Prince William County schools, where everybody knows my Afghan girls go, damn. All I can tell you is David may think that anybody can graduate from high school. Not anybody can graduate from high school. And of course, we haven't done a podcast on the updated scores about American educational attainment.
Yikes.
The NAEP scores, yikes. We're talking about kids from poor communities, mostly, black and brown kids, 2% of whom can meet targets at their grade level. 2%.
Utter failure of our educational system.
It is the failure of our educational system. But when we talk about adaptation, the notion that that guy should be allowed to stick a needle in me, no thanks. I don't want that. And so, that figuring out the problems in the building blocks of our society is just as important as figuring out how the Chinese want to eat our lunch and stopping them. And we don't have these conversations in any serious way. It's always gotcha. You screwed up. Teachers unions.
But it is the teachers unions, and then they want to have DEI to make it to sort of lower the standards for getting into medical school and things like that, because the secondary education is failing, and so we have to dumb down higher education. And what we end up doing is dumbing down the whole country as opposed to fixing it from the bottom up and fixing the education system through school choice and better options that way. But I want to go back to why they're related, which is, I don't know if you remember when we had Jim Stavridis on talking about his book on the potential war with China. And one of the points he was making is that, like, if they were to able to take down our power grid and, and all the rest of it, we don't want even our people in our Navy we don't teach celestial navigation anymore. Like they're basic skills of doing things without technology that we have lost as a society. Like if you can't do basic math and they take away the card reader in the store, nobody's going to be able to make change. And nobody's going to remember how to add and subtract. And eventually, if AI takes over, no one's going to be able to write a sentence because AI will do it for us. So there's a real danger of dumbing down our society. And then our adversaries just need to take out our power grid and our access to the technology, and boom, we're like in the Stone Age again.
Right. Our crutches.
That's a slight exaggeration,
exactly right.
but not much.
No, not much. Absolutely. I agree with you. Agree completely on this.
Amen.
So that is a good moment for us to end. So folks, remember, Mark can't give you change. And also, we are opposed to the dumbing down of our society.
There you go.
Let us know what you think.
Great takeaways from this podcast.
Take care.
Bye. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.